thank you for joining us. And no, you're good. You're good. I'm gonna angle. Well, I'll angle this way for now, and then we'll pass it along. So we are here for the human right to housing. This is in the way now. Yes. Here for the Human Right to Housing 201 session, and as I said before, this is a time for us to really think about how this stuff works in practice. I kind of gave the teaser yesterday of the overview of the human right to housing, that it's got these 7 different elements. It's got a lot of really detailed international law that's been developed over the course of the past 70 years that describes the rights. And because of that, if we use this language in our own legislation and our own regulations and guidance, then we can draw on that really rich language that's been developed. Thinking strategically as a litigator, if I get that language, for example, as has been proposed in some of the legislation in California, that says there's a constitutional right to adequate housing that has to be implemented through the maximum available resources progressively, then there's language at the international level that describes what that actually means. And so if later we need to sue somebody to start putting that into practice and say you're not doing it, then I can say, look, this language is the exact same language as at the international level. This is what describes, even though those terms, that amendment itself is only 3 sentences long, I've got paragraphs and reports that I can point to describe what that language means. So let's see here. Is Sarah Fox on? Oh, there's Sarah. All right. So we've got a couple of different presenters to help talk us through this today. We're going to start off with Sarah Fox from the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. You saw Senator Saud Anwar yesterday, who introduced the legislation, but the real mastermind behind the effort was Sarah. She'll give us kind of like a behind the scenes peek at like how we put together that effort that I think will be really instructive in terms of thinking about how similar efforts could go locally. Then we've got a team from the University of Miami Law School International Human Rights Clinic, who's going to help us walk us through some of the different elements and how we're using them at the National Law Center to measure our country's progress against the standards of the human right to housing. And then Michael Santos at Results will talk about efforts around a renter's tax credit at the federal level, which is, could be kind of a key step in moving us, at least on the affordability prong, towards the right to housing, getting us out of a system where every year we have to appropriate money to public housing or Section 8, and it's always less than we need, and instead to an automatic tax credit that's going out every month to renters to help make sure that their housing stays at a level that's affordable to them. And then we'll have time to talk and think about it together. So with that, I will turn over to Sarah. Sarah, do you have any presentation you're going to share or anything?
I do have a PowerPoint. I know I have about 7 minutes. Oh, you can't hear me.
Hold on a second, Sarah. Try speaking again, Sarah.
Can you hear me now?
I can't hear you.
People on Zoom can hear me.
Other folks on the Zoom, can you
Hi,
hear
yeah,
Sarah?
I can hear you, Sarah. I'm a
It's a
participant and I can
room
hear you.
issue. Okay. All right, we'll postpone Sarah's presentation for the moment to see if we can figure that out. And if you all are ready to present, then we'll turn it over to our University of Miami presenters, and I will get their PowerPoint up. Share screen. Thank you for working with us. Yep. All right.
But you're using this.
Yes. Yeah, just the arrows or the space bar, whatever.
All right. So hello, everyone, and hello, everyone on Zoom. My name is Katherine Murray, and as Eric mentioned, I'm here on behalf of the Human Rights Clinic at the University of Miami School of Law, together with my colleagues, Sarah and Miranda. And today we are excited to share with you some of our preliminary research and findings for our ongoing housing report card project in collaboration with the National Homelessness Law Center, in which we evaluate the federal response to homelessness and the lack of adequate housing across the United States using an international human rights law framework, both to critique current policies as well as inform new ones. We hope to use this tool as a way to advance advocacy as well as encourage government accountability in adherence to these human rights standards set forth by the Right to Adequate Housing. We are excited today to be among fellow housing advocates, and we encourage your comments, feedback, so we can better our report card as we move forward in the coming months completing it. So with that being said, I would just like to,
You have to click there. Okay.
oh, sorry. Just to briefly define what the right to adequate housing is, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, I think, defined it beautifully. The right to adequate housing is more than 4 walls and a roof. We are not suggesting the federal government need provide a house for every single person in the United States, but rather provide conditions which everyone is able to house themselves adequately in security, peace, and dignity, and to have policies in place which adhere to the 7 components of the right to adequate housing as set forth by the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. These 7 components are right here on the board. In the interest of time today, we will be discussing the first 4 that are highlighted in orange. And so to begin, I will kick us off with legal security of tenure. So legal security of tenure entails legal protection against forced eviction, harassment, and other threats to residency. 2 of the main components I have focused on in my research for legal security of tenure is, of course, the criminalization of homelessness as well as forced eviction. So as I'm sure all of you know by now, the criminalization of homelessness just further exacerbates the issue of poverty and homelessness across the United States. Cities across the United States have policies in place criminalizing the basic realities of daily life for people who are experiencing homelessness and punishing them for performing basic life-sustaining activities, which they often have no other choice but to do in public. The camping bans in place in 72% of the cities surveyed are particularly harmful as they lead to police sweeps of homeless encampments. These result in arrests and the confiscation or destruction of personal property and crucial identification items, leaving people experiencing homelessness who are living in these camps displaced without these crucial items and leading them to not be able to obtain housing or shelter without their identification items, or with a citation they cannot pay, or sometimes even an arrest. That being said, it is important to note when analyzing the issue of both homelessness in general, as well as the criminalization of homelessness, the racial disparities. Not only are Black people more likely to experience homelessness, but they are also more likely to be subject to police harassment and intervention, leading to more arrests and criminal records. And with the criminal record, it makes obtaining adequate housing in the future almost impossible, once again, exacerbating the cycle of poverty and homelessness. That being said, the UN has ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the Committee on CERD has called on the US to abolish laws and policies that criminalize homelessness and redirect funding from criminal justice responses to adequate housing and shelter programs. These recommendations are recommendations which we echo. We are calling on the federal government to condition federal funding away from the diversion of criminal justice responses as an entryway to permanent rehousing using shelters that are culturally adequate as well as trauma-informed as an entryway to permanent rehousing, and basically encouraging federal accountability to take enforcement action against states with these policies in place. As mentioned, I have also looked a lot at forced eviction and analyzed this with a critical lens on race as well. Black and Hispanic renters are twice as likely to be evicted as white renters, and an eviction letter on file, similarly to the criminal records that I was just discussing, makes obtaining adequate housing in the future difficult as one applies for housing. The best way to handle this is to ensure legal protection and legal counsel in eviction proceedings. It has been shown by studies that legal counsel for tenants in eviction proceedings increases the likelihood of unit retention by 75%. We have seen a positive trend since 2016 when the last housing report card was published, and right now 13 cities and 3 states have established a right to legal counsel in eviction proceedings by statute, which is a step in the right direction. We still have a lot to do regarding that. So in terms of our recommendations, we want this to be more uniform, requiring legal representation, as well as several provisions which increase tenants' rights in eviction proceedings. With that being said, I will give the floor over to Sarah, and she will discuss this further and the affordability and accessibility components.
And before we do that, Sarah Fox, can you try and do an audio check quick?
Can you hear me? Nothing.
So I'm assuming it's coming through on the Zoom, but we still can't hear it here in the room. Hold on a second.
Yeah, so. So should be able to hear it. So we're getting it. That should be coming through that.
Yeah.
The speakers at this point.
Can you hear me now?
Check Zoom settings.
Sorry about this, folks.
There you go. Speakers. There we go. That should work now.
Sarah, can you try again?
I am trying again.
Woo! All right.
Good.
All right. All right. So we will come back to you, but we'll let the Miami folks continue their presentation by putting this back on. All right. Go ahead. Oh.
Okay, so the 2 international law components on housing I've been researching are affordability and accessibility of housing. To start with affordability, housing should not be so expensive that other basic necessities are being neglected. People should be able to pay for their rent and mortgages without having to give up food, medications, and other basic needs. The United States is currently in an unaffordable housing crisis. We have a deficit of 3.8 million unaffordable homes. And I'm sure we've all at least felt or seen the impact, maybe even felt the impact of rent and housing prices increasing. I know I have, being in Miami. So with my research, I've been focusing a lot on the effective policies that have worked in combating unaffordable housing. One that I would really like to highlight is the eviction moratorium. Kate mentioned forced evictions and legal security of tenure, and the eviction moratorium not only helped people stay secure and safe in their homes, but also to not give up their basic needs again, like foods and medications. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing is an expert on the topic, and in his thematic report on COVID-19 policies and going forward from here, really celebrated the success of the CARES Act and urges the United States and other countries to be proactive in implementing some of these policies and combating unaffordable housing. Our recommendations follow suit in extending the eviction moratorium and permanently implementing some of these COVID-19 policies, as well as expanding social welfare benefits so people don't feel the need to have to give up their basic needs. Affordability and accessibility often go hand in hand as disadvantaged groups are disproportionately impacted by the unaffordable housing crisis. Housing should be accessible to everybody, regardless of economic status, race, gender, disabilities. People with disabilities are less likely to be shown apartments than able-bodied people, and racial minorities have a long history of housing insecurity, especially those with prior arrest records. In August of this year, CERD recommended the United States to strengthen the Fair Housing Act and affirmatively protect these discriminated groups in the housing industry. Our recommendations again follow suit in strengthening the Fair Housing Act, as well as including additional groups to be protected on the basis of sexual orientation, source of income, and many others, as well as enacting protections of discrimination against on the basis of immigration status, as well as prior arrest records. And now I'm going to hand this over to Miranda to talk about location.
So adequate housing has to be in a location where. Okay, so this kind of provides the definition of where adequate housing should be, and it should be in a location which allows access to employment options, healthcare services, schools, childcare centers, and other social facilities. It also should not be on nor near polluted sites, which kind of ties into the main aspect of my research, which is environmental racism. And my research has shown that communities of color are more likely to be adjacent to industrial facilities because of historically racist practices like redlining. The term redlining was coined because of actual red lines on the map that marked Black communities as hazardous. But the official definition is when the U.S. Housing Federal Administration refused to insure mortgages in or near Black communities. Because of this, Black communities are 13.7% more exposed to fine particulate matter than white communities. And these communities are more vulnerable because of lack of time and resources to attend meetings or to hire attorneys to fight on their behalf. Also, a study found that 77% of affordable homes are within 1 mile of, 77% of affordable homes are within 1 mile of hazardous waste sites. One woman shared her story saying that by the time we learned that the soil under our homes was contaminated, 40% of the children tested in our community had elevated blood levels. Because of this, CERD recommends cleaning up radioactive and toxic waste sites in areas inhabited by racial and ethnic minorities. Also, they recommend undertaking thorough investigations into cases of pollutions affecting these communities and hold those responsible accountable by providing effective remedies for the victims. Another aspect of my research involves food apartheid, which is a system of segregation that divides those with access to the abundance of nutritious foods and those who have been denied that access due to systematic injustices. And this kind of ties into supermarket redlining, which is where Black and Hispanic neighborhoods have fewer large supermarkets than their white counterparts, which leads to food insecurity. And food insecure adults are 68% more likely to suffer from chronic diseases like asthma and diabetes. Because of this, we recommend financing initiatives, tax incentives, or changes to the zoning regulation, which can be implemented to encourage large supermarket to move to these underserved communities. Also, we recommend providing funds to improve public transportation systems to increase food access in areas where grocers are over 10 miles away. That concludes our presentation. We wanted to thank you guys for listening, and we also wanted to stress that this is just like the preliminary findings of our research. We have an email address up there if you guys wanted to contact us with any of your thoughts or recommendations that you may have. And also, if you scan the QR code on the board, it leads to a more detailed synopsis report that goes into all the 7 elements of the right to adequate housing and provides just more detailed information on everything that we talked about today.
Great, thank you so much. And the report is also linked from the schedule page of the website. As I said, many more materials are going to go up after the conference, but this report is already available there if folks want to download it. So with that, we'll jump back to Sarah's presentation. And now that we can hear her in the room. Sarah.
Okay, can I share my screen?
Oh no, now we can't hear you again.
Uh,
Can you hear us now, Sarah?
I can hear you. That is not
Oh. All right. We'll go on to Michael and we'll get the
Drop down to the right. No, so the mute, see, the mute, there's your audio control. And it should be working.
all right, try again, Sarah.
hello, Eric.
All right, no. Try again.
Hello.
The trick is I need to start talking.
It was all right. Everybody else can hear Sarah, but us. Great. All right, Julia, can you get? Thank you. All right. Sorry, folks. Hybrid conference. All right. So, Michael, you want to
Sure.
present? I will bring this on down. Oh, and let me sign you into your PowerPoint. Stop this. Share. And you. Tax credits. Screen. All right. That's right.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Michael Santos. I'm Associate Director of our U.S. Poverty Campaigns and Results. We're an anti-poverty grassroots lobbying organization based here in Washington, D.C. And I'm here to talk about a creative way to actually achieve the human right to housing via progressive tax code. And I wanted to spend the next 10 minutes or so just to tell you a bit about who we are, what we're doing, and hopefully we'll have time for questions later. And I'm available for the next, several hours after today's session for those of you who are here in person. So I am actually a proud alum of the National Homelessness Law Center, and I see a lot of familiar faces. I'm really glad to be back here, back to DC. I also have lived experience of homelessness myself growing up. My family lived in poverty for a good chunk of the time that we first moved here when I was 14 years old to California. And before joining Results, I actually working at the National Homelessness Law Center, but also worked as an eviction defense attorney in San Francisco, California, where we had the right to counsel, second in the nation, protecting tenants from losing their housing, low-income tenants from losing their housing in the San Francisco area. And one of the reasons why I wanted to share all of that is because that really helped shape my approach and my views of how we can actually address housing instability and homelessness. And okay, next slide. So Results, the organization that I'm working for right now is an anti-poverty grassroots organization. We're a movement of passionate, committed, everyday people. And together we use our voices to influence political decisions that actually bring an end to poverty. We're relatively new to the housing space. For the past several years, we've been working on global health, maternal child health, AIDS, malaria, on the global side. On the domestic side, we've been working on the child tax credit. So we're relatively new to the housing space. I started working at Results in March 2021 after shortly moving to DC from California. So these are just some of the core values that we have at Results. End of poverty is possible and achievable. Poverty is driven by oppression. We actually have an anti-oppression set of values to guide us, that we use as our set of principles to guide us in terms of how we engage with members of Congress on the Hill. We primarily work with members of Congress on both chambers, and for the most part, we cover all 50 states, and we cover, I would say, about 75% of the districts across the country. And we believe that government has an important role to play in ending poverty, including housing instability and homelessness. We also believe that poverty is not a partisan issue, and nobody should be denied their basic rights to healthcare, housing, education, or economic opportunity. And for the most part, we subscribe to the belief of a human right to housing. So why exactly are we pushing the government, working with Congress? Well, we believe that government makes decisions about everything from taxes, investments, voting, services, social services, some of which actually impact, touch, and concern the housing and homeless services that we all push for Congress to keep funding. Yet many people actually don't know who represents them in Congress. And every time I asked, it's a common question I ask, do you know who your congressperson is? And almost always the case, they say no, right? And what we do at Results is really to educate and to empower our grassroots volunteers to join us to take action and to actually develop relationships with their members of Congress. And the idea behind that is really to not just contact them, reach out to them, but build relationships and hold them accountable to their decisions. So I really just wanted to share this one slide with all of you, and really this explains the approach that we do at Results and why we believe that it's really important to build those relationships with your members of Congress. And this is a chart from the Congressional Management Foundation, and it shows the top top 7 actions that you can take. And these are the ones that actually make meaningful difference when you're trying to engage your members of Congress. And on the very top is in-person issue visits from constituents. So we work with volunteers across the country, the constituents that lawmakers represent in Congress, and have those relationships developed over time. And for 2023, we will be working on this new campaign to reform the tax code and try to use it to address the affordable housing and homelessness crisis. So here's my contact information, but what I wanted to talk about now is actually the substantive policy that we're working on. So corollary to the human right to housing is ensuring affordability, right? And a key component to that of realizing the human right to housing is through measures guaranteeing the availability of affordable, accessible housing to all who require it. And the tax code is an important avenue towards providing relief for struggling renter households across the country. And as someone who used to do eviction defense in San Francisco, I could tell you that now, the quickest way for a person to lose their housing is for non-payment. They just simply could not afford to pay their rent. And so for the past year, as I mentioned, Results has been working on the child tax credit. So for those of you who are unaware, Congress did something spectacular in 2021, in the middle of the pandemic. Through the American Rescue Plan, they extended and expanded the child tax credit. And so what happened was the credit was bumped up. So families, depending on the age of the child, could get about $250 to $300 of a child allowance on a monthly basis. And that monthly basis really played a critical role in lifting children out of poverty during the pandemic, right? And the beauty of that monthly child allowance was that it was tracking how rent was paid, how your bills were paid. And so studies have shown that families actually use the child tax credit, the child allowance, to pay for basic necessities, for housing, to pay for rent, to pay for food, to pay for childcare, transportation. And what we've been hearing from advocates, from volunteers, is that rent eats up first. And I think it is the reality that most people, when you're trying to take care of your kid, like, you have to provide a roof over their heads. And so again, rent eats up first. And so we leverage our existing network, national network of grassroots volunteers and activists. And I made the conscious effort of really talking to the people who we are trying to help, because oftentimes I find myself in places where there's just a lack of representation from people who actually we're trying to help. And so we're trying to change that. And I've made a conscious decision to reach out to people with lived experience, people who have experienced poverty, housing instability, and homelessness. And what we've come to realize, it's that the tax code is just inequitable across the board. And the tax code provides billions of subsidies to other stakeholders but renters. So thinking about developers, thinking about homeowners, the mortgage interest deduction. And then there's also the child tax credit, but that's also limited for families with children. And so the big question that we're trying to address now is that if we know that CTC is being used partially to pay for housing, why can't we create another tax credit that would actually be earmarked for helping renters across the country, not just those families with children, but older adults, young people, to help afford their rents. And so this renter tax credit, I'm happy to dig in a bit more later, but the idea is it functions essentially like the child tax credit. And the goal is for individuals to get the tax credit if there's a difference between 30% of their income and the rent that they're paying. And it's what we're envisioning is it's going to be capped at 100% of the fair market rent, the small area for fair market rent in their area as determined by income level relative to their area median income. And so the idea is that we don't want people to be rent burdened, right? Like, if you're spending 30% of your income, more than 30% of your income, that you shouldn't be doing, you should have some type of assistance so that you can actually meet other basic necessities. And so, this is really along the lines of guaranteed income. Right. And what we're here, and there's actually a lot of guaranteed income pilots all over the country already. There's one by, I think it's Magnolia Trust in, I'm afraid I'm gonna mistake which state it's from. But that guaranteed income pilot actually focuses on providing guaranteed income to Black mothers in subsidized housing. And so we're tracking how that's actually impacted the people who received that type of assistance, that type of guaranteed income. And one of the reasons why we're pushing for a renter tax credit that's actually going to the renter is because it satisfies the need for immediate relief. If you, if like me, you've lived in poverty, I mean, I'll take any cash that I can take. And so what we've been hearing from a lot of our volunteers is, it's great that the Biden administration and other advocates are working on increasing the supply of affordable housing. But in reality, when you're in poverty and you really need that cash assistance right away, like you just don't have that privilege or luxury to wait for that long-term investment of increasing the supply of affordable housing that would take 5-10 years before you can actually start feeling the benefits of lower rent prices. And so that's what we're working on, and we really see this as another potential viable avenue for a human right to housing, and really help people stay housed, prevent them from getting evicted, prevent them from experiencing homelessness, and And while changing the narrative of poverty, we really want to empower people to use their own voice to talk about their own stories about housing and stability. A lot of our volunteers are working, they're part of the tax system already. Even those who are living doubled up or tripling up, experiencing homelessness, many of them are still working. And so there's, we're trying to find alternative solutions to the affordable housing crisis. And I know there are many interventions already put in place through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, through U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, through the DOJ, through the Department of Agriculture and Rural Housing. And so we're targeting Department of Treasury because we believe that it takes the entire government to actually solve the affordable housing crisis. We really want to make the tax code more equitable, as I said before. And one of the things that our volunteers have said is that we are tired of this paternalistic treatment of poor people. And, excuse my language, but just give us the damn money. Many of the volunteers, that's really what it boils down to. And so we believe that we can achieve housing justice through a different avenue. And this is like a different way of thinking about how we can address the racial wealth gap, the racial justice. I've talked to a lot of people of color in our volunteer corps. And frankly, we are tired of being studied. We're tired of being told like there's being thrown all these statistics about racial wealth gap. We actually want solutions. And one way that we can achieve housing stability is through economic justice and looking at the tax code. So I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to talk more later about the strategies that we use to actually move our members of Congress using, motivational interviewing or holding our members accountable. A lot of our volunteers do bird dogging. So for those of you who are not familiar with the term, bird dogging is when activists, volunteers actually show up in town halls to pressure candidates and lawmakers to go on the record on certain issues. And we also use the media as a very powerful tool. I'll leave it at that. But I think one thing that I really appreciate about the organization that I work for right now is that I, as an attorney, as a lawyer, I've been trained to do advocacy, legal advocacy in a certain lane, and results. The way we engage with members of Congress really opened up a whole set of possibilities to actually make potential change on the federal level. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Eric, and hopefully we can hear from Sarah.
Oh, Sarah, did you just say something?
I think I hummed, yes.
Yes. All right, so it's working again for some reason. Great. Let's hear from Sarah.
Okay. So, can I share my screen?
You can when I stop sharing this screen. Go for it.
Okay. Yes. Hold on. I must find it. That didn't work. Hold on.
Yes, it did.
Did it?
We're
Okay.
but you're not in presentation, or there you go. Yep.
I'm going to run through this rather quickly. I think actually the way that the sequence of this actually works out very nicely. So I'm Sarah Fox. I am the Chief Operating Officer at the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. I am a person with lived experience as well. I experienced homelessness as a child, and then my mother experienced homelessness while I was in college, and now lives in permanent supportive housing. And I have relatives due to intergenerational poverty, and even my big sister who might be homeless any day. And so it is a reality that drives me, and the economic barriers facing my family are real. And I obviously need to update the date on this slide. But that said, I think that homelessness and the impact of the lack of affordability make the right to housing so important, so that people and families like mine never have to sort of have the trauma that you live through when you experience homelessness. And so I use my voice to help educate, but I also have been fighting, and I am just going to stop sharing now because I'm going to walk you through this in a different way because it's going to distract me. Stop sharing. use my voice to really lift up this story. And I've been privileged to work along individuals like State Senator Anwar to fight for a right to housing in Connecticut. We have used many different tactics and vehicles along the way. And now I will share my screen. And so I put together sort of a timeline so you can see what we've done, and I'll walk you through just some of the tactics relatively quickly. You can see State Senator Anwar and Representative McGee, they were the leaders in sort of launching this fight across the nation, across the state with us, and really sort of like hoping to make Connecticut the first state in the nation to have an established right to housing. Going into 2020, we launched an aspirational bill to establish a right to housing in Connecticut. This bill was really just a beginning step into this, and it wasn't really, the language wasn't really fully rounded out. And at the time in 2020, we brought together advocates from across the state and statewide partners, but it was a first step in realizing sort of the divide in Connecticut, and which I'm sure exists elsewhere, between affordable housing and ending homelessness. Because I think that's driven at the federal level, and we also see it in the states, where when we talk about ending imminent homelessness for people, that for some reason takes away from like the need for affordable housing. And so we began to be at a divide early on in the conversation that took away from the levity of the bill. Also, the first go at this bill made it seem as though a right to shelter was something that we were seeking. Connecticut is not a right to shelter state. We've had tremendous success in our work to end homelessness, but that's really by coordinating our resources and by making sure that people can move from homelessness to housing rapidly. I say that, and now in 2022, during the tail end of the pandemic, we're still seeing the impact, and we have bottlenecks in Connecticut and wait lists for shelter, and we're seeing an uptick that we haven't seen before because we're unable to move people into affordable housing. So that's 2020. The pros was that it started a conversation. And when we talk about affordable housing across the state, it's a very divisive conversation. And that really began to illuminate those issues. We have 169 towns in Connecticut, and language started to come out about we want to keep the color of our town the same. We want to keep the tenor of our town the same. So really discriminatory language started to be voiced by landlords, by property owners, by people in each municipality across the state. The bill language was slightly confusing, and it really did, and it pronounced the tensions between affordable housing and resources to really move people out of homelessness quickly. So we took a step back. We re-envisioned the bill. We worked with Lalani Fahar, the former special rapporteur for housing at the UN. And we worked closely with Eric to sort of redevelop what we wanted to see across the state, really fighting for a right for safe and stable homes for homeless people, for a right to housing affordability, and a right to protections for housing loss. We also looked at, we put the language forth for Senate Bill 194. This was a new bill to progressively implement the right to housing in Connecticut. And it was just a different approach. We looked at the UN. We did exactly what Eric spoke to earlier. We really dug into the language. And we mapped everything out. So each guideline we compared to what existed in Connecticut, what resources were needed. So we had an overall rubric to work from, and we could see what legislation was already in the hopper. We put together an omnibus bill with everything within it. And we also looked at the California bill that Eric worked on, establishing a council to study the right to housing. And that was sort of our plan B to fall back on. It became sort of encapsulated within. This we engaged stakeholders across the board. This was a really robust approach, from doctors to teachers to public health individuals to students and professors at Yale. It was comprehensive, and it was also seen as very costly. One of the things, I think Connecticut is seen as a very wealthy state, but the wealth really stays with the wealthy individuals. So anything with the fiscal note was tossed aside. And we also just saw really increased tensions with landlords and property owners. You know, we're talking about 2021. We've had the eviction moratorium. Anything about people accessing housing who have criminal backgrounds, who are those who individuals do not want, you know, who landlords might be most likely to deny housing. They want to really keep that and be able to sort of maintain those practices and not be questioned. And that is something that has been incredulous to see. We've had housing committee meetings where, you know, which are all virtual and live, where people really have made shocking statements, and where people have just come out in opposition of having a right to housing and having people have all of their basic needs met around housing within their community. So this last year, we really stepped back. We took the fiscal note piece very seriously. We sort of reeled it in, and we realized that maybe what the best way to start this off is by really having this council and having a task force to drive this work and sort of oversee this at the state level, so that we can, you know, make a strong first step. Because the most dangerous thing is to develop an aspirational right to housing that really doesn't mean anything. And I think when I listened to Michael, and what I heard from Michael around tax codes, like all of those things are really important, but you need to have accountability and you need to have teeth. And so we can't just say we're going to establish a right to housing and have it made into a bill and codified without actually having any state level accountability. So we wanted to develop something through the Department of Housing, and to include and have a review and accountability body to fight for the right to protection from housing loss, safe housing that meets all basic needs, the right to housing affordability, rehousing assistance, and recognition of special circumstances for people who face particular obstacles to find safe and affordable housing. And so we look to establish a task force on the right to housing, you know, and at this point in time, I'm not going to walk you through those, but at this point in time, we're really looking at like what we're going to do for next session, how to move this forward comprehensively, and do it in a really respectful way. We at CCH are dedicated to this legislation, but it is hard to move it and to make people understand the importance of a right to housing. I feel like the conversation in Connecticut, as I'm sure across the country, is sort of like housing doesn't rise up. It's seen as something that you deserve, and really all people deserve housing, and it's something we need to be invested at really at the federal level, and all states have to be committed to. We're fighting for that conversation to take place in Connecticut and to have the investments that we need. But it continues to be a fight, and it's all about public will. And right now, honestly, we do not have the public will to move this across the finish line. I'm hoping that this legislative session, it's our fourth, our legislators will really take to this and hear the need, and they're seeing it. They're just not really mobilized in the way that we'd want them to be. So, which is a depressing tone, but I have hope that we can actually do this better this year and bring more people into the fold to fight for housing justice. There you go.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. And for folks online looking for CLE credits, our first very appropriate code word is challenge, CHALLENGE, challenge. And that frames where we are right now. I think the great thing is, as Sarah was saying, is we have this challenge, but we also have the tools. There's so many resources out there. She mentioned the UN Special Rapporteur's guidelines on implementation of the human right to housing. Those are some of the resources that I make-the-shift.org, maketheshift.org, that I mentioned yesterday. And whether you're looking at it through the 7 elements of the right to housing, as the University of Miami students did, or you're looking at it through these 15 or 16 elements of the guidelines on implementation, it gives you, you take that language and you apply it to your state, your community, and you say, how can we put this into operation? And the kind of great thing about the human right to housing framework is it creates an obligation of outcome, but there's no specific obligation of conduct. It doesn't matter exactly how you get there, but what matters is that you get to the end where everybody has the right to adequate, accessible, safe, dignified housing. So that could look like renters tax credits. That could look like more vouchers. It could look like more public housing, social housing, community land trusts, rent abatement, lead abatement, protections from the environmental racism. All of those things are part of it. But what the right to housing framework gives us is a tool to say, you don't have to do it any one specific way, but you also can't say, I'm not going to do anything. And right now, not only are we not doing anything, we're doing negative things to make the right inequitably insured. And so this gives us a tool to come back every year and be able to say, these are the things you have in place. You're not all the way there yet. There's an obligation on the government, and it's not charity. Again, it's not optional. We need to be doing something to ensure people's basic human rights. And the mechanism that was talked about in the Connecticut bill, this kind of review committee, the idea is to bring people together in a committee similar to the Constitutional Review Committee that I mentioned yesterday from Finland, where it's not just a study committee to make recommendations, but there will be involvement of people with lived expertise of homelessness, of poverty, who are there at the table saying, these are the problems that we have, these are the solutions we need to see legislation that's actually, or regulation or policy that's actually going to put this into effect. If we don't have that policy, then we're going to create some consequences for what that means. So if you don't have enough affordable housing in your community, if you don't have enough emergency shelter, then there will waive the zoning restrictions for that entire community. So those types of that type of housing can be put anywhere by right. And so the default is no longer what it is right now, which is that housing just never gets built. The default becomes, that housing will get built. And so it incentivizes communities to actually figure out the best ways to make that happen. So that's kind of the shift we're looking for in the right to housing framework. But now we've got another not quite half hour, 20 minutes or so to talk about any questions folks have for any of the presenters, or thinking about how you might want to do this wherever you are.
When you speak about problems with housing, it's usually referred to people having difficulty paying rent. It's seldom referred to people having difficulty paying a mortgage or homeowners association requirement. Because rather there is some housing that's rather affordable, but it comes with a homeowners association fee.
Right. So the question was around homeowners and homeowner associations and affordability issues with homeowners as well as with renters. And that's absolutely true. And we need to ensure, the right to housing again. That's why, for example, the renter's tax credit is a huge step forward for people, some of them, many of the most vulnerable people, but it's not everything. And there should also be mechanisms in place to ensure homeowner, emergency mortgage assistance, the same way that there was emergency rental assistance during the pandemic. Foreclosure protections, a right to an attorney in foreclosure cases, not just in eviction cases. In Scotland, for example, part of their right to housing legislation includes an obligation not on the homeowner, but on the bank. If your loan is in danger of going into foreclosure, the bank is obligated to notify the state so that the state can potentially provide you with some emergency mortgage payments so that you don't lose your home. And again, that's incentivized, because if you do lose your home, then the obligation is on the state to actually rehouse you, and they want to avoid that. So their incentive is to keep you in that home. Yeah, there's real there are mechanisms for doing that, and those are, should be part of the overall conversation around the right to housing. Anybody else want to respond to that, or Lisa, and then
thank you to the law school presenters, and I'm wondering if you have, I really am really happy to be hearing in all of the presentations here about having common language and really unifying over our common language. Do you have a one-pager on something you in the 7 steps that I can actually take back into my community and really start, something simple? When I'm here, I dive into a lot of some of the gritty stuff, but the people I'm going to go back to, I need really simple messaging. Do you have a real simple one page?
We are
so the question, folks online couldn't hear, just looking for real simple language, one pager sort of thing on the human right to housing.
So right now we have a synopsis report that's a little bit longer. It's like 30 pages and includes our research, but that is something that we will definitely do. And I think that's a great idea to bring some of that language into the community. So we would definitely work on that. And then we can discuss at the end and get your email and send it to you. But I think that's a great idea.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm ready. So, and then the people that I spent a lot of time in it, like sometimes 16-hour days in camping throughout the entire pandemic for every single day. And I love hearing about tax credits and going to meet your legislator. There is no way any of that comes up on any of their radar. There's no way. What are any agencies, or what are you experiencing how to be the bridge to get people there? I mean, I got probably about 25 people registered to vote, because I typically went out with volunteers and we walked around with people's cars and all that kind of stuff.
So I would actually recommend that you check out our website. We have a few resources there. And the way we've done this is we dedicated staff time and staff capacity to actually provide support for people who are interested in taking action. And so I think it's a question of like, how do we get to that initial? There's that initial hurdle of like not having time, not having capacity, but also like nervousness. You go on the hill and you have to just like this, right? And for someone who's like glad to get it in, and I have to be, I volunteer, but how can I feel so out of place, right? When I walk into the hallways of Congress. And so there's also that initial hurdle of being intimidated because they feel like there's no
if not for people. And so I think one of the things that we've been doing is really doing more outreach to different communities. And one of my colleagues, Asian content, is actually specifically working with homeless moms in Pennsylvania. And she's also targeting other states. I'm happy to connect you with her to see about the engagement that how we engage with those populations. Because the last thing we want to do is create more harm. And we're very, very mindful of that. I think there's a lot of, when to be honest, when we're talking about advocacy, there's a lot of pitfalls and possibilities of being open for these stories. And I think that's really the number one challenge that we're getting from a lot of our authors is that, I have lived experience that all the time, every time I've been contacted with other organizations, it's just because they want to hear about my story, but like there's no deeper. So what results in doing is actually providing a deeper engagement with volunteers. And the key is really meeting them with it, right? So to your point about like simple having a simple one page, right? We are very mindful of that. And we're still continuing to work on how we can make ourselves more accessible for people with disabilities. We know that there are barriers to actually having that type of civic engagement across the country. And I think the National Low Income Housing Coalition also has a home for both that are holding their
Our homes are votes.
Our homes are votes. So also recommend that. But I'm happy to give you my colleagues contact and to learn more about how to do engaging. Very, very interesting way. Again, this is like the first time that we've done this, and we're still building this model and trying to figure out how we can scale it to other places.
Just on the fact sheets, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Right to Housing's website. If you just type in, Google Special Rapporteur housing, you should be able to find online has some resources. The maketheshift.org again has some great resources, and the graphic that we showed yesterday with the kind of house and all the different elements of the right to housing, that'll be available after the conference as well. So yeah, we're definitely working on producing just those kinds of resources. Where's the room mic? Oh,
I can do it. It's probably easier.
I want to thank the whole family because listening to each of you. Thank you. Listening to each of you, you show the importance of a multi-pronged approach to the whole issue. Particularly interested in environmental justice. Yes, in 1987, that landmark report on the occupation is in the United States, commemorating the 40th year this year. I'm just curious to know, I'm thankful that you're lifting that connection, and I want to know what was the spark for you as a young person in law school to continue to lift that very important.
That's a great question. So actually,
and repeat the question. Or I guess, did folks online, could you hear when she was speaking with the microphone? Okay, so yeah.
So in undergrad, actually, I minored in urban and regional planning, and I took a lot of courses on climate change and environmental vulnerability for coastal communities. So that's kind of where the interest for me started, with specifically for climate change. So then I just started taking a lot of classes that tailored to that interest. And then once I got into the human rights clinic, I wanted to bring my interest into the work that I was doing. So that's kind of how I met the two of the human rights approach and then also like environmental justice. Thanks for your question.
Anybody else have it? I see some questions coming in online. We'll check those in a second.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis, for the presentation. I just want to know that Sarah, she mentioned that that they were creating a commission in Connecticut. Just to instead of look at how we do rights. And I know here in Washington DC, we have, you know, we have our local, it's not Home Street. And we have, in that we have Homelessness DC and Code, which in there has roles as well, which called to establish a commission to look at housing and human rights. And I'm just wondering, you know, when we talk about establishing these commissions and looking at housing and human rights, you know, what do you guys think is probably the best way you want to kind of move forward with a broad, you know, public policy that will, you know, based on, you know, housing and human rights. And then I know that there are people who don't believe in housing and human rights. They actually believe it's a commodity. And how do we kind of bring that language that we say, okay, if it's a commodity, it's a commodity. It also needs to be global, sustainable, and sensitive also.
All right, you could hear that, Sarah?
I think I heard the majority of it.
Okay, so yeah, if you can describe a little bit more in detail about the commission approach, what would be involved in that, and yeah, I guess we'll start there. And also, before you do that, I'm going to give out the second CLE code word, which is solution. Solution, which is what we're working on now. So go ahead, Sarah.
So the commission approach is really developing accountability through our Department of Housing and bringing in, just as Eric said, people with lived experience representing all, actually the bill language that was developed brings in people representing all different walks of life, experiencing challenges to housing security. And ensuring that they are front and center in decision making. And the commission would be appointees would be appointed by the governor, and the language in the bill stipulates a lot of different, and I'm happy to share the bill language with Eric, so you have it. The language stipulates all different levels of individuals. And when I say levels, like people within different organizations, people with experience, people with experience of domestic violence, all different types of individuals to participate in this council or in this task force to sort of begin the enactment of the language and around the right to housing, and begin to sort of set the teeth and accountability structure for it.
Yeah, again, the important piece is like that there would be some teeth, that it's not just a study commission to write another white paper that's going to get shelved and do nothing, but that there's that will, because what, you know, the right to housing is so broad that to try and sketch it all out at once would be, you know, it would be a report in itself and like 1,000-page bill to try and do it all. And so by the approach of setting up a commission that's going to have representation from the people who are most directly impacted by the policies is a way to start building that policy, knowing that it's going to be progressively implemented over time. But also not allowing, as I said, for nothing to happen, you know, for a report to just get shelved. And so it's going to be more than, you know, what people think of as just a commission, but really, yeah, a tool for ongoing accountability and progressive realization of the right. And the bill language, it's was Senate Bill 194 in the.
So this was Senate Bill 168. I will share all of the bill language with you so that you have it, because there's Senate Bill 105, 194, and then 168.
Yeah, so we'll make sure that those links are available on the forum schedule webpage after the conference. If Sarah, you can send them, if you can put them in the chat now for people online, that'd be great too. Thank you. Anybody else thinking about how?
I had a question. I had a question for you.
Okay.
Around It's actually more closely related to guaranteed income. So we're, I'm project managing a guaranteed income pilot in Santa Clara County. And one of the questions that we have right now, our researchers really want to track temptation items or goods, which we are very hesitant to do, but as a lobbyist, I'm wondering, our goal really is to see where this money, if this money is going to change people's financial security when it comes to housing, for example, right? How important do you think as a lobbyist is it to collect that data? Okay, or what I've been also recommended is to concentrate more on the qualitative interviews and extract that data from that. But just wondering, I mean, I'm willing to look at two sides of it, and we're still kind of deciding whether or not we're going to delve into these questions with the research. I just don't want to perpetuate a narrative, right, of like what people are spending their money on necessarily. When we know from when I read the research, thank you for also mentioning the Magnolia Trust. Yeah, so but and that was our original intention, but we got a lot of pushback with just giving money out to Black mothers. So we expanded the demographic to kind of need to reach that population in another way as much as we could. But that was also it's been a long 2 years. So just wondering what your opinion was on that, because as we're looking in 2 years to really think about policy.
Yeah, I think it's really important to have that study. Are you talking about both the quantitative and the qualitative?
Yeah, the researchers would like more quantitative.
Right, so I think both will be really helpful. The qualitative, I think stories speak. They're very powerful, and it's something that our grassroots have learned through their years of advocacy. A lot of our grassroots have developed their relationships with members of Congress. They lead those relationships. I am actually privileged and happy when they invite me to those meetings, and some of them have been developing those relationships for 10, 20, some 30 years. They follow closely their members of Congress with this though. But the stories are really powerful. I think it's really helpful. The quantitative, I think that will also be great. I'm actually doing some outreach to a lot of academic researchers to start bridging that gap between economic security and housing. And when I talk to a lot of economic justice advocates, the question I get is like, why are we not talking about housing? When I talk to child tax credit advocates, right? I make it a point, like, yes, you need to be talking about how important the tax credit is, that PIC credit, in helping families afford their housing. Because we don't talk about it, and there's very limited studies to show that. And so I think the more connection, the stronger the connection that we can make in terms of studies, the better. I think it's really, really powerful to have that data, evidence-based data available on the hill. So if you decide to do that, please reach out. That'd be very, very
Ours is a family, a child, they have to have a child under the age of 30. It's a 2-year pilot, $1,000.
I also wanted to just say to the point that you were making earlier, Michael, about how people don't necessarily feel comfortable walking into the halls of Congress. Another really great technique that we saw used by the organizers for the human right to healthcare in Vermont is the use of people's tribunals. So rather than bringing people into the halls of government, you bring the government folks to the halls of the people. And so, in a community center, at a church, wherever, where people feel more comfortable, have them offer their testimonies, do a full day. You can get, in some cases, they got like some of these UN human rights experts to come in and sit as if this were, a human rights tribunal, hear the violations of the rights to housing, to healthcare. And, you can use it to do some education, some basic education with people, and kind of explain the framework. And then you can hear about the violations, all those testimonies, record them, put them on social media, use them to pull out some of the qualitative data, and then, force your elected officials to sit there for several hours, hearing those testimonies, hearing them in the context of, again, we're not begging for charity, we're seeing violations of our rights, and we're demanding that you, our government elected officials, do something about it. So it's a really great technique. The Vermont Worker Center has fantastic experience that they're happy to share about how they use that to actually create, a right to health care bill in Connecticut and get it passed. Ultimately, it got vetoed and whatnot, but It passed the legislature, and one of the kind of great things about it was it really built this culture of healthcare is a human right across the whole state. And it was from the ground up, and it helped the bill be shaped by all those testimonies, and fill in some of those gaps that people had like mentioned yesterday, that as the legislation is developed, you know, people find ways around it. And so they were kind of gap filling as they went along, by doing these tribunals across the state. So that can be a great technique to use. But I see that we are at the end of this first session. So yes, please.
So going back to the study as well, I think one of the reasons why we've also like opted for the tax credit is there's a study that Shriver Center in Illinois had done on guaranteed income. And there was like an appendix that just talked about the impact of guaranteed income on subsidized housing. I believe the guaranteed income have the effect on some of the subsidized, if you live in subsidized housing, it counts as income. And so the fear is that, you know, you're on that precipice and cliff, right, that it will bring you over and then make you ineligible for the housing assistance. And so with tax credits, the child tax credit, for example, is structured as, it doesn't count as income, right, for federally subsidized housing purposes. So I think that's like one thing that you should be aware of is like the impact of housing and subsidized housing, the impact of guaranteed income and subsidized housing.
I will quickly say, just to loop back to that, thank you for mentioning that. We are targeting rapid rehousing families specifically. We are, so half of our families are coming from a grassroots organization. The other half of our families are coming directly from our housing queue, our rapid rehousing queue. So they will have a subsidy during this time. However, we were able to get lots of waivers for our local HUD agencies, CalWorks for California. So all of our state agencies, food stamps, the only one we were not able to get a waiver for was SSDI. So that is going to be an issue, and you know that we want to explore what ends up happening with choices around that. So I appreciate you mentioning that. Can you just repeat to me what that study was though, from Senator Illinois you said?
Oh, the Shriver.
Shriver. Thank you. I'm
If
gonna
you
look that up.
Google.
Pretty important for like, so thank you.
Awesome. So I want to thank our panelists. This is a fantastic presentation. We are going to have a Human Right to Housing 202 session this afternoon, where we'll hear specifically from a couple of lawyers here at Aiken about lobbying techniques and what you're allowed to do as a nonprofit organization, keeping you within the law, as well as some good tips and tricks. And then again, be able to dive deeper. We've got even more time this afternoon to think about how to put this into practice. For those online, we'll be on a break until about 11 o'clock. And for those here, again, we'll be on a break. You can grab some food or coffee. In this room, we're going to have the Stopping Cicero session. Vehicle residency will be down in A. Decrim advocacy post-Martin will be in C, and helping the helpers will be in D. So thank you, and we'll see you in 10 minutes.
Thank you.